Eliot Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As your testimony shows, the international community has not yet formed a consensus on how to reduce cyber conflict. For example, some of our adversaries in cyberspace have advocated for an arms control approach, while America is focused on establishing global norms and confidence-building measures. So let me ask Dr. Lewis and Mr. Butler, what do you see as the greatest factors motivating countries to support one approach over the other, and what are the most significant barriers to fostering a greater international consensus? Why don't we start with you, Dr. Lewis?
Thank you for the question. One of the things that's interesting is that while there's a wide disparity of views on what we should do, all countries are afraid of cyber war, and this is from the biggest to the smallest. And many of them fear Cyber Command quite a bit. And I always wonder, should I tell them the truth, or should I let them continue to believe that we're omnipotent? But that's the impression, and so it's that shared fear that drives the negotiation. The dilemmas with a traditional arms control approach, which is the preferred Russian approach, is it's difficult to define what is a cyber arm. They clearly would like to include information in that category. The Russians talk about information weapons, which doesn't make any sense, right? But they would like to control information, and they have supporters in the world. So the treaty approach has verification problems, it has definition problems, and that's why the U.S. decided to go after norms of state behavior. You have to think about how you would verify compliance with norms, and you have to think about penalties if norms aren't followed. But the arms control approach has just not been that useful because of its sort of structural problems that we face. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Butler?
Yes, Congressman Engel. I think the incentives and the factors for driving people into this discussion, really, everyone is affected by some type of malware or maliciousness that's going on in cyberspace, whether it's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, or allies are affected. And so there is an incentive to come to the table and discuss. The challenge, as Jim indicated, is there is fear. There's problems with taxonomy. We have different doctrines in terms of what's in cyberspace, what's not in cyberspace, these physical, logical structures. We are also challenged with regards to understanding our overall objectives as we come to the table. As we look at, for instance, the United States, we're trying to create an open and secure environment that allows for a global transaction platform and national security. Many countries don't see the benefits in that, but they see it as a U.S.-defined environment. And so going to multi-stakeholder types of venues actually helps us, the government group of experts, for instance. And then finally, I would say that one of the other barriers is getting folks involved in the global economic system. And here's where the private sector, again, comes into play. I think it's important for nations, whether they're very, very developed or underdeveloped, to see where we're heading and helping folks to begin to see the value of being on the Internet. There is this aspect of fear that not only comes from cyber war for high-end states, but as we think about some of the underdeveloped countries of the world, not understanding exactly where we're going in terms of an interconnected society.
Thank you. Dr. Lotriante, let me throw a double-edged question at you. As international conflict increasingly moves into cyberspace, we need to be prepared for situations in which our military engages in hostilities overseas without deploying troops outside the United States. So in your opinion, would such activities trigger the congressional oversight and authorization requirements of the War Powers Resolution? And what steps should Congress take to ensure that cyber activities of the U.S. military fall within these oversight and authorization requirements? And let me also add that as the United States works to develop global norms and customary international law governing cyber conflict, what legal clarifications are needed to ensure that we are able to prevent and respond to cyber threats by terrorist groups and other non-state actors?
Okay, thank you for the two-part question. First, on your question with respect to the applicability of the War Powers Resolution, So as it is today, the language of that statute today, for most of the cyber activities that one could anticipate or think of, where the U.S. would be conducting these activities abroad without soldiers engaged abroad, my position on that and the current state of the language is it is not applicable, meaning that if you look at the words within that statute, there could be a whole scope of cyber activities that would not trigger. So if the President is honestly looking at that statute and trying to fulfill his reporting and consulting requirements, there are a lot of activities that would not be triggered. There are two elements of that resolution that bring me to that reason. The two triggering elements for reporting is the words armed forces and hostilities. And when you're talking about not just cyber, but other emerging technologies, even drones, nanotechnology, there's a slew of new technologies in which this resolution is wholly inadequate in terms of covering. But particularly with cyber, when you're talking about armed forces, that language needs to be expanded if you would like to cover and trigger that consulting and reporting requirement from the executive branch, as well as the phraseology with respect to hostilities. That has to also be expanded. So, for instance, on the armed forces, it's not so much armed forces will be involved overseas necessarily when you're talking about the use of cyber tools by the President, but you need to use the language that would be suitable for that statute would be something to the effect of adding capabilities, language about capabilities, or even provisions or supplies. And as far as the phrase in the statute on hostilities, I would expand that language and not just leave it as it is today, but expand it to include it's not only engaging in hostilities, but it's also potentially the violation of a sovereignty of another nation that may trigger it. Now, this of course would take some consultation, but if you ask me the original intent of that statute, if we wanted that original intent to consist today, and you want the reporting and consulting that was envisioned for the legislative branch in the war-making process with the President, that's what I would say would need to be changed. That was the first one. Would you like me to go on to the second question you had? Or
Should we do that in writing? Maybe we just answer.
I guess we can do that in writing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me ask